Alright, so I'm out here shoveling snow with my dad. He's working the snow blower. We got about this much snow last night. Today it's still snowing. Meanwhile, you guys are nice and safe inside. You're warm. Maybe you're getting ready to study a little bit here. Today we're going to be looking at percentage fractions, and we're also going to continue trying to find the author's point of view. And with the author's point of view, we're really looking at his opinion or her opinion about what she's writing about. So before we get to that, I have to finish shoveling snow here. So we'll see you in a little bit. All right, fifth graders, we're going to be expressing fractions as percents. We did this yesterday, but we did it in a slightly different manner. Yesterday, the fractions already had a denominator of 100. Today, the fractions will not have denominators of 100. And to show you how we're going to do this, I have a question written on the board. It says, Luna spent 1/4 of her money on shoes. Which begs the question, Luna, why are you spending 1/4 of your money on shoes? You should be spending 1/4 of your money on food for the class, or presents to your teacher, or something nice for Miss Fun, who is also your teacher. Anyways, we'll get back to this question. And the question is, what percent did Luna spend on her shoes? Well, there's two ways we could do this. One is using a model, and the second way is using equivalent fractions. We're going to start off by using a model though. So remember, it's asking us how much is 1/4, or what percent is 1/4. Now it might be that you can say, Mr. Lesevich, I can do this in my head. And I'll say, great. But the point is not to automatically do it in your head because these are easy numbers. The point is to learn the process. So I'm going to use a model here. Now I know that we're looking for 1/4. I also know that 4/4 is the whole, would be all the money she has. So that's what I'm going to base my model on. This has 4 parts. And all 4 parts equals 100. We're looking at 1/4. And we want to know how much 1/4 is out of 100. So the way I do this then is I take the total number of parts, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, and I divide 100 by those parts. So 100 divided by 4 equals 25. So 1 part equals 25. Since I only need to know 1 part, my answer is 25%. That's how you do it using a model. Now, what you might find is that just using equivalent fractions may be a little easier. So the way I do that is I have 1/4, and I start to ask myself, I need to find an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100. So I have to multiply both the numerator and denominator by the same number so that I have a denominator that equals 100. So I ask myself, what times 4 equals 25? Or what times 4 equals 100? To which case, Andy shouts out, 25, Mr. Lesevich! And I say, thank you, Andy. You are absolutely correct. So I'm going to multiply 4 times 25, but I'm also going to multiply the numerator by 25. And the answer that gives me is 25 over 100. Now, based on what we did yesterday, we know that if we have a fraction with a denominator of 100, I can just write whatever the numerator is as my percent. And so my percent equals 25. We're going to do at least 2 questions here together, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity to do a few problems on your own. All right, so here are our sample questions. in which we're going to express each of them as a percent. Now, for one of these, we're going to use the models, but for all of them, we're going to find the equivalent fractions. Now, 3/4 is the one we're going to use the model on because it's a small enough fraction. Whereas if we use the model on 200 500ths, we'd have to make a box with 500 sections, and I don't want to do that. So we'll just find the equivalent fractions for that. But we'll start off with the model for 3/4. So what percent is 3/4? Well, once again, I'm going to make a box with 4 sections. The whole thing, all 4 parts, is equal to 100%. But what I'm asked to find is 3/4. So just like in the other problem, I take the total number of parts and divide 100 by 4. So 100 divided by 4 equals 25. So I know one part is equal to 25, but I have 3 parts. So I then have to multiply 25 times 3, which equals 75. And that becomes my percent. I can do it using an equivalent fraction as well. And I'm going to do a little erasing here. Bum, 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 bum. Shake the board, shake the board. I have to ask myself, all right, what is an equivalent fraction when I need a denominator of 100? That's an awkward way to say it. But basically, what times 4 equals 100? And this time, Louis shouts out, what? That's what you always shout out, Louis. I'm kidding, Louis. I'm giving you a hard time. You shout out 25. And that's right. So 4 times 25, but I also have to multiply the numerator by 25. So when I get that, it's 75 over 100. Since my denominator is 100, my numerator is equal to the percent. So that's 75%. Okay? Now, 7/20 works the same way. I have to start thinking, what is an equivalent fraction in which I can get 100 to be the denominator? So I'm going to put the times there, equals. Now, this only works doing it this way if an equivalent fraction can be made where the denominator is 100. But I have to start thinking, what times 20 will equal 100? And Junie this time shouts out, 5! 5 times 20 is 100. And I'm like, Junie, you're brilliant. So I multiply the denominator, 20 times 5 equals 100. Then I also have to multiply the numerator by 5, and it gives me 35. So since the denominator is already 100, I know that my numerator equals the percent. So that comes to 35%. Now in these two problems, when I found my equivalent fraction, I was multiplying. But in this case, the last question, my denominator and my numerator are already larger than 100. So instead of multiplying, I have to divide to find my equivalent fraction. So remember, I'm trying to get the denominator to equal 100. I ask myself, 500 divided by what equals 100? And this time Kelly shouts out, Mr. Lesevich, 500 divided by 5 equals 100. And I say, once again, I have the smartest students in the school. So 500 divided by 5 equals 100. But I also have to do 200 divided by 5. 200 divided by 5, what does that equal? And this time Jerome says, Mr. Lesevich, it equals 40. And I would say you are absolutely correct. So I get 40 over 100. Since my denominator is already 100, all I have to do is write this as a percent. 40%. All right, in a moment, you're going to have several questions appear on the screen, and then I'd like you to go ahead, solve those problems, and the answers then will show up in a few seconds as well. All right, so magically, there's going to appear a word problem on this board. And that's our next step, to solve real-world math problems, expressing fractions as percents. So this particular question says, there were 500 computers in a warehouse, 200 were shipped to a store. The first question is, what percent were shipped to the store? And the second question is, what percent were left in the warehouse? So the first thing I have to figure out for this is what number basically equals 100%. And that would be 500. If I had 500 computers and 500 were shipped to the warehouse, that would equal 100% of the computers. But we know that's not what was shipped. How many were shipped? 200 were shipped. So at this point, we have to find an equivalent fraction in order to get our percent. And I think we just did something very similar to this. So I have to ask myself, what is an equivalent fraction in which this has a denominator that equals 100? Or 500 divided by what equals 100? And as we've seen just a few seconds ago, 500 divided by 5 equals 100. Boy, this is the same exact question, isn't it? Why did well, it was in the book. All right, and then I know that 200 divided by 5 equals 40. So what percent was shipped to the warehouse? Well, 40% was shipped to the warehouse. But the second part of that question was, what percent stayed in the warehouse? Did I just say warehouse twice? It's what percent was shipped to the store and what percent stayed in the warehouse. Well, if you add up all of the computers, that's 100%. Since 40% were shipped, all I have to do is subtract, and I have 60 left over. So 60% were left over in the warehouse. All right. That was a pretty easy example question. I'm going to put a couple more up on the screen for you to answer, and then we'll put the answers up there as well. Whoops. All right, small children. That's basically your math lesson for today. There'll be on Class Dojo, I have a sheet downloaded on it where you can answer questions and then upload it back to Class Dojo. Just take a picture of it, put it in your portfolio, and then you can move on to your next assignment. Actually, you're going to do some questions on IXL math again as well. And then after this, you can go ahead and do your language arts assignment as well. We'll see you later.